Opening title appears. Universal Design in Higher Education. Title swipes across the screen, followed by Roger O. Smith, followed by Tim O'Connor, followed by UW La Crosse. Title fades to black. Universal Design and Testing, Part 2, Tim O'Connor. Video fades to black. Tim O'Connor standing behind a podium in front of an audience.
How universal design can improve testing. Research findings and practical reasons for using universal design in testing. Now, one of the things you'll notice already, I like to talk about research because in my mind, that's what tends to prove things, or at least kind of show you things that work versus things that may not work. So I tend to try to use a lot of research in what I'm talking about here. Here are some important concepts in universal design and testing. Tests need to be accessible to be effective tools of measurement. In other words, to be valid, they have to be accessible. This is one of my favorite quotes of all time. It is a dreadful irony that students with disabilities have better access to school buildings than they do to the curricula within them. And that's something that can be easily changed. Okay, when you talk about costs and the things, changing buildings, that's expensive. And we need to do that. There's no doubt about it. We need to make buildings accessible. But in a lot of ways, our buildings are more accessible than our curricula. That's something we can change. That's something that doesn't cost money. It just change the way you think. UD principles help everyone. Preliminary research findings suggest that all students may perform significantly better on tests applying universal design principles than on traditionally designed tests. And I'm going to talk about some of these kinds of things as we go along here. Tests need to accurately measure student learning to be effective tools of measurement. In other words, in order to be valid, they have to effectively be able to measure what it is students have learned. Whether assessment is embedded into teaching, in example of curriculum-based measurement or administered separately, large-scale assessment, it must provide students with adequate and equitable means to express their knowledge and understanding if it is to provide accurate feedback on the performance of students. Another thing you'll notice, I read these slides. That's a universal design teaching technique. Don't assume students can read what's up here. And I'm not talking just students with visual disabilities. Another thing we're going to talk about a little bit here is learning styles. And Roger alluded to the student who's writing frantically. You know, people learn differently. Auditory learners may not be able to look up there and truly understand what you're saying. So you show it up there, you say it, you're reaching both visual and auditory learners. And research also shows that multiple methods of learning styles, if you use multiple methods, is more effective learning for everyone, no matter what their style is. So that's another important point to keep in mind. So that's why I do that. I'm trying to model these things. Many assessments appear to have been designed under the assumption that learners are relatively homogeneous and that the expected outcomes for all students are relatively the same. As a result, assessments are rarely free of confounding information and thus rarely represent a truly accurate measure of student abilities. We're making huge assumptions that I created this test, this is what I taught, okay? It's going to effectively measure everyone's learning. That's not the case. If we implement some universal design techniques in both our teaching and our testing, we can more accurately measure student learning, plus improve student learning. The medium of a test is a very often overlooked dimension. Most testing depends on a single medium, text, for the majority of learning and evaluation. As important to our culture as this medium is, it is not equally accessible to all students. For students with reading-related disabilities, among others, this dominant medium of instruction is more of a barrier than a ramp. I cannot tell you how often, if you would really look at your tests carefully, to you, they'll make a lot of sense. They'll seem easy because you have understanding of the discipline you're talking about. You know this stuff. It's important. You understand it so well, backwards and forwards. So often, we create tests that become reading tests. They're not really measuring the student's learning. That's why June will recommend for some students you read the test to them or that it's taped for them, because reading is such a difficult job for some of these students. We need to find ways to make it not that. And it's the point I want to make here, it's not just students with disabilities. Okay? Everyone reads differently. And even some students are incredibly smart, sharp students may not be able to read your test and really understand what it is you're saying. That's an important point to remember. That's why you think, when you think you're writing test items, don't think they have to be so difficult to really measure their learning. That's not the case. Don't make it a test of reading. Make it a test of their knowledge. Make the reading as simple as you can. Make it the knowledge that you want to find out. Do they know what it is you want them to see if they do actually know it? In the light of student differences, administering assessment using a common format does not level the playing field as educators believe. Rather, a single format tilts the playing field, favoring some, hampering others. Text, perfect example of that. Students who read well do better on tests. We have research over and over and over. And that includes course tests, because they can read. They can understand things when you put it down on paper. You know, I was a perfect example. I'm a visual learner. I had a lot of trouble in courses because I'm not an auditory learner, and so many of my professors through the years lectured. That was very difficult for me to deal with. I had to spend my time putting as much as I could down and then rewriting it, putting it into a visual format, because that's how I learn. However, you put me on a test, and the normal test that most people get, I had no problems whatsoever because I was a good reader. That's the way I learned. That's the way I understood things better. That's not true of all students. That's another important point to keep in mind. Ability to demonstrate knowledge can be obscured by reading and text presentation difficulties. The medium of the test is not weighed into its reliability or validity. That's an important point, and that includes statistically it's not weighed in when that's done. Even on standardized tests, that's a huge issue that is not being met by our testing companies. The style of learning should be a consideration. I've already alluded to that some. Research has shown how important the method of student learning styles, is to how well learning is accomplished. Yet this is seldom a consideration when we devise our methods of assessing student learning. Tests should not measure extraneous information. We also know, and this is something I've talked about already a little bit, that available research indicates that the current methods of large-scale assessments are generally inadequate for students with disabilities. Particularly problematic is the issue of construct irrelevance. Many assessments measure not only the targeted construct, but also unintended constructs related to accessing the test material or carrying out a response. Reading is the one that most often comes up there. Examples of such unintended constructs include, here's some others, sensory capabilities such as sight and hearing, physical capabilities such as holding a pencil, and cognitive capabilities such as memory and attention. I want to give you an example of one that happened a few years ago in our office. Our office, Testing and Evaluation Services, does some special accommodations for students with disabilities for courses we give the test. We had a final exam. It was a blind woman, first semester French, I believe. She came, and the final exam was one question. Explain, of course in French, exactly what you saw on your way to the test this morning. Well, I mean, she could have probably answered it in one word, but, you know, again, and when we contacted the professor and said that, she's just like, oh my God, I didn't even think about her. She'd been dealing with this student all semester, but she didn't think about that when she created this test. And it's just one of those kinds of things. It's like, oh, duh. But you gotta, when you create a test, you gotta think about all your students. Who can and can't answer those questions? Make it something so that it does assess their learning.
Video fades to black. Closing. R2D2 logo appears. Title reads copy and distribute freely, but use in its entirety and do not alter. Access said project, copyright 2009, Rehabilitation Research Design and Disability R2D2 Center. Please visit us at access-ed.r2d2.uwm.edu. The Access Ed project is supported in part by the U.S. Department of Education Office of Post-Secondary Education, PR Award P33A050090. The Access Ed documents contained in this video are those of the grantee and do not necessarily reflect directly on the U.S. Department of Education.